Hello, everyone. We're back and we're live with the 2018 Hack Summit, and we're privileged to be here with Nader Al-Naji from Basis, which used to be called Basecoin. He's the CEO of Basis, and we are privileged to learn about his new algorithmic central bank here. And just to warm folks up here, we have a poll for the audience that Nader has created before we started the event. And feel free to start answering this right now, and we'll go into the poll answers in just a few minutes. So Nader, thanks again for being here with us. You know, we couldn't have done this event without you. You've been so supportive in terms of your promotion and your support for the event. So thanks again for your time today, Nader.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ed, for having me. I'm really excited.
Great. So Nader, you're the CEO of Basis, and maybe you could start to fill us in a little bit more about your background before we dive into the projects, so that people can get to know you personally a little bit more. So what's your background? How did you grow up? How did you get into this area? Maybe fill us in a little bit more about that.
Sure, absolutely. So I'll go kind of my general background and then maybe the cryptocurrency layer on top of that. So I went to high school in Virginia. I went to undergrad at Princeton, studied computer science with a minor in applied math. After Princeton, I went to work at D.E. Shaw, which is a trading firm, a quantitative trading firm. I worked in equities, algorithmic trading. And then I did that for about a year, and then I went to Google, where I worked as an engineer in ads and search for a total of about 2.5 or 3 years before starting Basis. And then with regard to cryptocurrency, I got really interested in Bitcoin in 2012-ish in college. And the funny thing is, I read Satoshi's paper at the time, and I was like, "Whoa, this is a really big deal." But I didn't really get obsessed with it until I realized that there was free electricity on campus. And for people who know, that basically means you can like mine Bitcoin for free. And so once I learned about the free electricity, you could say I responded very aggressively to that incentive. I basically immediately, looked up the cost of building a computer with like 2 really powerful GPUs, finding like the most effective like dollar per hash and stuff like that. Nothing like the ASICs that people do, nowadays. But yeah, I ran it in my dorm. It kept me warm. And what's funny though is, I was what you could say like a Bitcoin maximalist. Like there wasn't really anything else, nothing I really, captured imagination, I think, at the time, other than Bitcoin. And I was like, this is really going to take over the world. This is the first, truly independent, neutral monetary system. This is going to change everything. And it led me to take a couple of courses on monetary theory and monetary history, because I became curious. Like, I was like, how traditional monetary systems worked? Like, what are the foundations of fiat money, really? And what's interesting is those courses kind of were a bit of a disillusionment for me. Because the professor, one of the first things in the courses that we learned is that, most currencies that you use today are actually elastic supply and not fixed supply like Bitcoin. And it's actually been that way for about 100 years. And there's actually a reason for that. It's kind of a feature, not a bug, which is that, among other things, it allows the currency to be stable in value. And I was the biggest troll in these classes because I would basically raise my hand and be like, you don't need that. Like, why doesn't fixed supply work? Like, are you sure? Are you sure? And, really, I rarely went to office hours in college, but I went to like 4 office hours in a row with the professor, just, kind of beating her down, being like, hey, like, I think fixed supply is still, this volatility is fine. But I really became convinced, she convinced me that, the stable aspects of traditional currency are something that is Bitcoin it really can't cross the chasm without having those properties. And so we'll go more into that. But the mission behind Basis is really taking kind of the learnings of traditional monetary policy and monetary theory and bringing them to Bitcoin so that it can actually cross the chasm to being used for mainstream applications. So that was 2012, and actually in 2012 we were trying to add a more robust monetary policy to Bitcoin when we were in school, but we couldn't figure out a way to do it without compromising Bitcoin's decentralization. like we had a crazy idea where like we'd have like, oh, what if this private key, controls the monetary policy, so it can expand or contract supply using that private key. But for obvious reasons, that's centralized. It's not only worse than Bitcoin, it's actually worse than fiat money, because at least the people who control fiat are generally elected and aligned somewhat, right? Um, so that wasn't really a good idea, and so kind of gave up on it, and until about 2016 or 2017, where the Ethereum kind of woke me up again. The price, I also had kept my mind Bitcoin, so the fact that the price was higher, I kind of woke up again. I was like, what's going on here? And learned about Ethereum, which was a huge innovation. And one of the big things it enabled was Basis, because basically there was this concept, which we'll go into, but this concept of an oracle, which allows you to get the price of Basis from the outside world onto the blockchain, and then you can do your monetary policy on make it a function of that, which can get you the stability that is kind of not there in the traditional cryptocurrencies. Anyway, but so learned about Ethereum and kind of had this concept in my head. I wrote a blog about it, about basically an early white paper for Basis in early 2017, and so many people were emailing me super excited about it, basically saying, oh my God, this is it. This is the thing that was missing. This is going to take us over the chasm. This is going to make it a real, going to make cryptocurrency go mainstream. And, the support was really heartwarming and kind of shocked me, really. And I said, I'm going to leave Google to do this. I have to do this. And I was originally just going to do it basically by myself, like Satoshi style, just going to write all the code and that's that. But actually, when I gave my 2 weeks notice at Google, in the very first week, what happened was I was inbounded by Naval Ravikant and Alex Pack from Bain Capital, who were both super excited to be involved in the project. And Naval in particular said, hey, like, and very wise advice at the time, which says, he says, hey, like having more people involved in your project, getting a round of funding, having backing, can actually help you a lot with regard to building trust in the project and actually helping grow it, getting the team behind it that we really need to make it a big success. And so, I said, you're right, we should do that. So ended up doing a small seed round there, and the rest is history.
It's an amazing story. It's an amazing story, Nader, and
Mm-hmm.
and it really is inspirational to see kind of how, as an engineer, you can evolve to running an organization almost organically like that. And so, as you went through this process, maybe it would be helpful for the audience to learn maybe the problem that we're trying to solve here. So, like, what are the problems and issues that are happening around the world that Basis could theoretically help address, and maybe that'll set the context for the innovation that you've created.
Definitely. So just at a high level, Basis is a decentralized stable cryptocurrency. Like we'll go into that in a second. But really, I mean, what we're trying to do at Basis at a high level is we're trying to build basically the most robust monetary system that's really existed. Something that is, like a 10x improvement, on the status quo. And to understand kind of what that is and what's going on there, it's useful to go back and think about what is the status quo of cryptocurrencies today, right? And so the interesting thing about almost all cryptocurrencies that are out there today is that they're very volatile in value. So if you look at Bitcoin, Ethereum, or really almost all of them, the price fluctuates a lot. And so at the high level, the kind of economic reason why there's this volatility is because most of the cryptocurrencies out there are essentially fixed supply. They have like a roughly fixed supply either in the long run or now. It's approximately fixed. And the issue with that is that when a currency is fixed supply, it can't respond to fluctuations in demand without corresponding fluctuations in the value of the unit. And so basically, because you can always count on demand to be volatile, if the currency's supply is fixed, then the price is also going to be volatile. It's the law of supply and demand. If you have a fixed supply and demand doubles, price must go up. And so what's funny is, again, you look at all the currencies that exist today, almost all of them, they don't have a fixed supply, they have an elastic supply. And it's for precisely this reason that stability of value, among other things, is very important. And so our thesis at Basis is really that the volatility of the existing cryptocurrencies is kind of blocking mainstream adoption. And I kind of can explain why if you just think about an example. So if you're doing a transaction, like you want to go to a store and buy something with Bitcoin, that's actually not a big problem. Like the Bitcoin being like very volatile is kind of bad for that, but you can still do it without too much issue. Where you really get hit very hard by the volatility is whenever time is involved in a financial contract. So if there's any time to settlement in your payment, or if you're doing any really the most basic financial contracts in our economy, like loans or salaries, you find that this volatility moves against you. Like time gives volatility an opportunity to move against you. And a really easy way to see that is actually with just thinking about a salary denominated in Bitcoin. So imagine that you go to your employer and you set up, you're going to be getting 1 Bitcoin per month, and that's like the contract. Then what's going to happen over time, inevitably, is either the price of Bitcoin is going to go up, in which case the employer is going to kind of feel like, hey, I'm kind of paying you too much. Like, I'd really like to renegotiate the amount of Bitcoin that I'm paying you, which is a problem. Or the price is going to go down, in which case you as the employee will, want to renegotiate or, just not be making enough money. And so when you really stop and think about it, you realize that most of the basic financial contracts in our economy really don't work with even small amounts of volatility. Even like 15% a year is too high. And so that's kind of the issue, I think, that's keeping cryptocurrencies from crossing the chasm right now. And the other tricky thing that a lot of people don't realize, or maybe it's a common misconception, is that this volatility is actually never going to go away. So it's commonly thought that, like maybe when Bitcoin gets really big, it'll be, zero volatility, or it'll be like, stable enough that we can really use it for a lot of financial contracts and stuff. And we think that's actually a misconception because as long as a currency is fixed supply, it's always going to be subject to volatility in demand. And you see this historically with deflationary spirals, inflationary spirals that happen when you have a fixed supply currency. And another great example really is gold, which even though it's been around for thousands of years and it's a relatively known quantity, the volatility of gold is still about 15% annually. And so even gold, isn't something you really want to denominate a basic financial contract in. And so to summarize, we think the volatility is kind of precluding mainstream adoption, and that it's not really going to go away unless we adopt some of the elastic supply lessons of traditional finance into cryptocurrency. And so that's kind of where Basis comes in. So, but before we go into Basis, it's kind of useful to just highlight Bitcoin again, and kind of what Bitcoin did. So what we see is that Bitcoin itself, we really see it as essentially a really major technical innovation. And the way I think about that innovation is I think about what is an app, like a normal application. So I think of an app as actually 3 things. A database, which is kind of like state, right? What is the state of your app? Code, which is kind of like rules that govern the state, like how do you update the state? Well, the code does that. And so there's this kind of flow between the app, between the database and the code. And then the third thing is an owner or an admin. So someone who can modify rows of the database or update the code, update the rules of the app to iterate it or to fix problems. And so if you think about it, Uber, Airbnb, all of these apps are really these 3 things, right? A database with a set of rules and an owner. And it's very useful because you're able to iterate, you can find product market fit, you can fix problems. But the interesting thing that Bitcoin did is it gave you for the first time a database with a set of rules, but no owner. And in fact, the update process is basically everyone has to opt in to the update or it's not going to happen. And so that model, you think about it, like, why is that useful? Like, that seems just more constraining than the traditional app model. but it turned out to be extremely useful for money. And so in particular, a money database like the monetary system, the rules are relatively simple, so they don't need to be really updated that much. And the owner actually tends to get in the way. For example, the owner will modify rows of the database to give himself a lot of money, which is kind of inflation. Modify rows to set other people's balances to zero. That's kind of like asset seizure or freezing assets. And so, Bitcoin for the first time said, hey, here are the rules for a money database. It's fully baked. There's this opt-in mechanism where you can do to update it, but there's no owner. So there's no one that can unilaterally modify these rows. And that was a game changer, because basically, to me, it really solved one of the biggest issues that was causing monetary systems to be unreliable in the past. And so that was Bitcoin. It was this killer app for money. But the problem that we inevitably realized is that the rules are a little bit too simple, or they need to be augmented a little bit to get parity with what existing currencies do. Which is, in particular, the rules make Bitcoin fixed supply, which inevitably causes that volatility that we were talking about. And so the idea behind Basis is, what if we could take the rules of Bitcoin and, without compromising on the decentralization, without compromising on all of the ownerless kind of nature of it, what if we could keep all of those benefits and also have stable value, right? And that's really what Basis is doing, what it's trying to achieve. And so the next thing that's useful is kind of to understand how we achieve that. So to understand that, you kind of have to think about Bitcoin, right? Again, it's this ownerless database, essentially. And Basis essentially makes two changes to Bitcoin. The first change is that the Basis system sources the price of Basis from the outside world onto the blockchain. So the blockchain can actually be aware of what the price of Basis is as an exogenous variable. And so the way we do this is very interesting, and I'll get into it later. But there's a word for it called Decentralized Oracle. But the high level is that although we basically start by having the price of Basis come in and be referenced to $1, essentially, in the long run, that can transition to being a basket of goods reference. So it can actually upload not its value in dollars, but rather like its value relative to a basket of goods. And the system can transition to being independent of fiat currency. But at a high level, get the price of Basis onto the blockchain is the first difference between Basis and Bitcoin. The second difference is that instead of being fixed supply, the supply of Basis grows and shrinks in order to keep that price stable. So initially at $1, in the long run at a basket of goods to be independent of fiat. And so it's really more of an interest rate mechanism, but the high level way to think about it that's easy to understand is when the price of Basis is above $1, the system expands the supply to push the price back down to $1. And when it's below $1, the supply contracts to push the price back up. And so what's really interesting about Basis is that the way in which it achieves this, first of all, how you do it is really, really important. But the way in which it achieves it is actually analogous to what existing central banks do, which I'll go into now. And so at a high level, when the supply of Basis needs to contract, the protocol sells a second type of token called a bond token. And it sells that token on the blockchain for Basis in an auction. And so the bond tokens go into circulation and the Basis goes out of circulation. And that's how the supply of Basis is contracted when we need to do that. And you'll notice it's similar to something called an open market operation, which existing central banks do. But that auction is happening on the blockchain and totally decentralized. So then the reason why people participate in these auctions and the reason why they buy the bond tokens is because when the supply of Basis needs to expand, the protocol pays back the bond tokens at a rate of 1 Basis per bond token in the order that they were created. So when the protocol contracts the supply, there's this queue of bonds that gets created and sold for Basis. And when it needs to expand the supply in the future, it's paying back these bonds in the queue. And the last part of the protocol, that's almost the entire protocol, But the last part of it is a lot of the times you need to expand the supply of basis, but there are no bonds to pay back. So because we only create bonds in a contraction, that queue of bonds gets longer during contraction, shorter during expansion. And if you're expanding a lot more than you're contracting, you'll have a situation that which that queue is empty. There's no bonds to pay, but you have to give the free basis to somebody, right? And so for that reason, the protocol has a third and final token called the share token, which collects all of the new basis pro rata when there are no bonds in the queue. And so essentially, there's this kind of zero lower bound in like traditional monetary theory where you've, basically you hit 0% on your interest rate. Like it's kind of like you paid back all the bonds in the basis system. And then you're like, oh, crap, I still have to create free money. How do I do it? And what's interesting with basis is the way we solve that is interesting. It's almost like helicoptering money throughout the economy until enough of it has been created that the price restabilizes. And it goes to these the share tokens. And so that at a high level is how the protocol works. And the really interesting thing about it is we think that it's the first monetary system that can essentially be stable, neutral, and also decentralized, right? And so the reason why, obviously stability is important, but neutrality is also really important. What you find is that countries kind of don't want to use each other's currencies. It's almost like, China doesn't want to use the dollar, the Americans don't want to use the Chinese renminbi. And so what you create with basis, if it actually works, is a nation-state independent stable currency, which we think is actually what you need if you want something to be globally adopted or to improve on the status quo. And so that improvement in essentially like that neutrality, we think can really take us forward in terms of the reliability of the monetary systems that we build. The second aspect of basis is the decentralization. And so it's very important that the ownership of the system and the governance of the system be decentralized. And so another aspect of the system is that it's constantly giving away these share tokens, which are also kind of governance tokens of the system, on the blockchain, selling them and burning the basis. And so that aspect of like constantly decentralizing the system also means that the ownership of the system over time becomes more diffuse and more spread out throughout the world. And so it can really be this kind of collectively owned, independent, neutral monetary system that's also more stable than existing monetary systems. And that's what we're trying to build. We think that we're basically taking the improvements that Bitcoin brought to the status quo and carrying in that stability and adding it to the policy. And yeah, that's really what we're up to.
It's incredibly fascinating. Yeah. And so when you think about this at the high level, is there ever a concern in your team's mind about once you start to scale this, given that there aren't actual tangible physical assets behind basis, but that it's algorithmically created? Mm-hmm. Is there a true value in that? And how do you think about value in the form of whether people will embrace this as something that could be used as a store of value or as a medium of exchange?
Yeah, it's a great question. And so the way we think about it's what's interesting about basis, right, is as you mentioned, it doesn't really need to be backed by anything, right, in the long run. And what's funny is that if you look at the existing monetary systems, like the U.S. monetary system, interestingly, it's also not really backed by tangible assets. It originally started as being backed by gold after World War II and something called the Bretton Woods Agreement. But then in the 70s, it actually said, we're not backing this by gold anymore. We're going to use this interest rate mechanism to keep it stable instead, right? That's basically what happened. And what's interesting is that interest rate mechanism has actually worked very well for keeping the US and other monetary systems all around the world stable. What's interesting is whenever it breaks, it's actually not because the interest rate mechanism didn't work, but because the people who control the interest rates decided to compromise stability for another reason. So a great example of this is actually there was this great speculative attack on the British pound with the Bank of England. And what happened there was the Bank of England kept interest rates really low for a really long time. and basically opened themselves up to a giant speculative attack. It was as if in the basis system, if we just chose not to issue bonds for many, many years, and then someone was like, "Cool, I'm just gonna short and destroy this thing because there's no support, like there's no contraction happening," which we would, the protocol would never do. But the reason why that happened in the Bank of England scenario is because, in general, central banks have two mandates. They have a price stability mandate, and then they usually have an economic growth or an unemployment mandate. And what can happen is the unemployment or growth mandate can be at odds with the stability mandate. And often you'll find politicians will say, I think this stability thing is not a big deal, or like it's not going to happen it's not going to destabilize during my term. I'm going to worry more about the economic unemployment kind of mandate here and not worry as much about the stability mandate. And so that's actually what generally happens in monetary systems is one mandate gets prioritized over the other. The interesting thing about basis is we really only have one mandate. The protocol has one mandate, which is the price stability, and doesn't have that economic growth mandate. The key insight behind basis is that we think when you compromise that on that unemployment mandate, the problem you're solving becomes so easy that you can essentially do it algorithmically. And moreover, without the need for backing with tangible assets, right? And so that's really the superpower that the basis system has, is that it's compromising, essentially. And that's good because we think it can be algorithmic, we think it can be independent, all those benefits that you get. But of course, it's also bad in the sense that it's not going to optimize for unemployment. It's not going to optimize for economic growth. And so that's a drawback of the system, but one that we think actually leads to more value potentially being created than if we had tried to do both mandates.
Yeah. Makes sense. And when you think about a medium of exchange versus a store of value, maybe you could help define those for the audience as well. Where does basis fit into those concepts? Is basis one or both of those?
Yeah, it's a great question. So store of value is a lot of people talk about the definition of money. It's like store of value, medium of exchange, and unit of account. Those are like the three things. Store of value just means that I've worked a lot and I need some way to store my the labor I've done, or like the goods I've given and sold to other people. So I store it in usually a currency. And so Bitcoin is mainly used as store of value. In other words, you kind of hold Bitcoin for the value that it's preserving for you or increasing for you. And so that's kind of the store of value use case. Medium of exchange means you're actually transacting with it. And so you're going out there and you're saying, hey, I want to give you a MacBook Pro for some amount of Bitcoin or basis or something like that. That's medium of exchange. And then unit of account means that you're actually pricing stuff in it. So what's interesting with Bitcoin is when people go to buy stuff with Bitcoin, either online or in person, they're often not pricing in Bitcoin. They're saying, I need $100, so I'm going to go look up the exchange rate, and I'm going to say it's this much Bitcoin. And if you wait an hour, they'll give you a different amount in Bitcoin. And so that's actually Bitcoin not being used as a unit of account, even though it's being used maybe as a medium of exchange in that case. And so with basis, what we're really trying to tackle is all three, right? People will store value in basis because it's stable and they know that it's going to be able to buy the same amount of goods in the future. So they have that buffer. We call it buffer capital. You might not store all your money in it, but if you have to have some kind of buffer to prevent you from, to keep you being able to buy like your goods for the next week or two, basis is useful for that. And that's a big use case in developing countries where their currencies are very volatile. And then also taking on that medium of exchange and unit of account, right? So because basis is stable, we think you can actually price things in it. You can actually think in basis and say, I want to pay you this much basis, not this much Bitcoin because it equals this many dollars. And so that's kind of the three prongs that we think basis can carry us to.
Makes sense. And if you think about kind of, I was reading about your system earlier, and it seems to rely on a game theory concept known as a Nash equilibrium to kind of incentivize the parties to work together at scale. So maybe for those in the audience who don't have a statistical background, maybe you can help them understand the whole game theory behind Nash equilibriums and how that applies to basis.
Yeah, it's a great question. So what's interesting is, with traditional monetary systems, the central bank will when it wants to contract the supply, will take bonds off its balance sheet and sell them. for cash, and then that cash goes out of circulation, right? Basis does the same thing. But what's interesting is the reason why people buy the bonds in Basis is because, again, they believe that the amount of expansion in the future is sufficient to pay them for that risk that they're taking. So you're basically paying a risk premium from the future growth of Basis to the speculators who are willingly locking up their Basis during times of decreasing demand. And so what's really happening there is we're essentially saying, like, look, there's a lot of fluctuation in demand. There's a lot of volatility. But what we can do is we can use future demand, so the future demand for Basis, and take some of it right now to pay speculators to smooth out the volatility in the demand over time. And so that's really what's happening with Basis. Is it's an equilibrium that's held up by taking that future demand and using it to patch up demand today. So that's kind of how the system operates.
Great, thank you, Nader. Okay, so let's take a few audience questions.
Sure.
So we had a comment from the audience. This is just a request for Nader to, I guess he noticed that your camera was shaking a little bit, so maybe
okay.
maybe you could stabilize that a little bit. Definitely. And then we'll jump to the next question. Thank you for that comment, by the way. Mm-hmm. The next question is about scalability in Basis.
Yep.
So blockchain, after all, is very slow. How will Basis handle scalability? Andrew Murdoch asked that question.
It's a great question. Thanks, Andrew. Yeah, so initially Basis is launching on Ethereum. And so Ethereum is an excellent platform that, because it basically abstracts away the consensus layer so that you can just work on building all of your monetary policy in a smart contract. And so initially we're tied to Ethereum's scaling plan. But in the longer term being about a year or two from now, we plan to release our own blockchain in which we are going to actively research scaling and also incorporate all of the innovations that the community comes up with as well. Either that or actually add our scaling solutions to Ethereum. But we think that it'll be easier to kind of start from scratch and research it ourselves to make our own system. The other reason why moving off of Ethereum is important in the long run is the security of the Ethereum network is actually dependent on the Ethereum token itself. And so it's not good to have Basis's security be tied up in the security of another, in the value of another token, essentially. That's another reason why moving on to our own blockchain is a good idea from a technical standpoint. But yeah, both scalability and technical standpoint are important. So yeah.
Makes sense. Thanks, Nader. Next question comes from Valdemar, who asks, how does Basis compare to MakerDAO? Who mints the new supply?
Yeah, great question. So what's the way for people who don't know, MakerDAO is a different approach to stability, which is essentially using Ethereum as collateral to back a stable cryptocurrency. And so the way they do that is they have essentially an Ethereum smart contract that says, if you give me $2 of Ethereum, I will make you one stable coin. And if you want to bring back that stable coin, you can get you can unlock your Ethereum or redeem it for however much Ethereum it's worth. There's a few. So first of all, it's a very interesting approach to the problem. But there's a few issues that that we think prevent it from really being able to scale in the long run. So the first issue is that because Ethereum and really any kind of collateral you'll want to use, even if it's not Ethereum, because that collateral is volatile, so it can fluctuate in price. What you're doing is you're predicating the stablecoin on another potentially volatile token, right? So in order to deal with that problem, what they do is called over collateralize the stablecoin. So for every stablecoin that's out there, they have 1.5 ETH locked up, essentially. And I think actually they had to increase it to make it 4 ETH or something because ETH is really, really volatile. But the high level is that you basically have to have a ton of ETH locked up in order to create even one of your stable tokens. And what ends up happening is you have two sources of demand. There's the demand for the stable coin, and then there's the demand for people who want to lever up on ETH or lock up ETH and get a stable coin. and what's very tricky about this is the demands are fairly unrelated. Like, you need them to line up. You need the people who are locking up to be equal to the number of people who want stable coins, or else it won't be stable. But the issue is that they're going to differ. And so in order to make the system work, you have to have some kind of tax or interest rate on the stable coin that then gets paid to the people who are collateralizing in order to line up those two sources of demand. But really, what you're doing is you're taking away from the stable coin and giving it to the collateralizers to make the system work. But what that event essentially adds up to is pasting together two demand functions with volatility, right? And for that reason, we think it'll actually be much more volatile if it's even really able to scale. Although it is a very interesting approach. The core difference between something like MakerDAO and something like Basis is actually collateralizing not on Ethereum or something that needs to be over collateralized. It's actually collateralizing on future demand, which is basically something that any currency will have, right? And so by collateralizing on future demand, we don't have this issue where where we're not going to match up the two sides, right? Future demand is this thing where you can say, okay, we're going to sell bond tokens right now, and at some interest rate, someone is going to buy them, right? And so the high-level idea is that by collateralizing on future demand, we avoid this mismatch that you find when you try to collateralize on something volatile. So
makes sense. Thank you, Nader. Let's go to the next question. So I'm going to jump down a little bit to a question from Nelly, which is related to an earlier comment you made, Nader. So Nelly asks, could you elaborate on how helicoptering the money makes it more diffuse in the distribution? Wouldn't you give shared token pro rata to people already owning Basis?
I'm not sure. You're saying maybe you're saying why do we give the new Basis to the share tokens as opposed to giving them to the Basis holders?
Yeah, I believe that is her question.
I will assume that is your question. Yeah, so this is actually really interesting. It's actually an FAQ on our website. A lot of people don't know that my original blog post for Basis, it was called Treasury Coin, and it only had bonds and Basis. So it paid the Basis back to the Basis holders. This was actually the thing that got everyone really actually people excited about both, but that was actually the thing that Naval originally read and everyone read. And the issue is that we think it really doesn't work. The reason being that, and it takes a little bit of time to think about it and realize it, but the reason why it doesn't work is you have this stable coin, and let's suppose that it's $1, right? And let's suppose that you believe that it's going to be $1 forever, right? Then let's also assume that it's going to get distributions of Basis at some rate, right? It's not really known like how many distributions it's going to get, but it's going to get distributions. So the question is the net present value of the future distributions going to be equal to $1? And the answer is probably no. It's probably going to be much higher than $1, which means that you're probably going to be willing to pay much more than $1 for the Basis. And so what happens is when you pay Basis to Basis holders, you're essentially creating this weird, unstable incentive to buy Basis when you think that other people are going to buy it, and sell Basis when you think that other people are going to sell it. You're essentially creating reflexivity that all the other cryptocurrencies have. The problem with this is that it's much more likely it's highly likely to immediately crash after the first reflexive run-up in demand. So I think that some people have tried to add approaches to this original approach we put out there, like having an Ethereum reserve and stuff like that. But it's really, you're just creating a mathematical contradiction in the stable coin. And we think that it's much more elegant to say, this is the stable coin and it is stable. You buy it for stable value, similar to the dollar. These are the bonds and these are the shares. And this is what you speculate in. And so we think that's a more elegant thing. What arises naturally is that if the share tokens are not decentralized, then people are not, the distributions of Basis aren't getting out there enough. Or they're not getting widely distributed. They're going to this privileged class, which we really don't like. And for that reason, the protocol is constantly selling share tokens on the blockchain for Basis in an effort to distribute and decentralize the tokens. Similar to mining, if you imagine like mining with a high inflation rate, like like a 5% inflation rate, that's a similar thing to what we do with share tokens, which prevents the like landed gentry from essentially like owning the share tokens forever. It's constantly like turning over and requiring being active.
Thank you, Nader. That's a great answer. Mm-hmm. So let's go to the next question from Scott Rudiger. So he has more of a political question for you, Nader, which is that monetary policy is so tied up in politics. Politicians usually don't want to rein in inflation during their terms in order to artificially prop up the economy for purposes of re-election, which you kind of touched on earlier. In the long term, how do you see states and countries adopting an algorithmically stable monetary system and giving up that control that those in power previously had?
Yeah, it's a great question, right? Basically asking, how does Basis run up against existing, right? So what's interesting is that we actually don't think that Basis is going to be a super demanded thing in the US. The people in the US already have access to a very good stable currency, which is the dollar. Where Basis really gets adopted is in developing countries all over the world where they have high inflation. And so there are basically countries all over the world where their currency is inflating at a rate of 10% a year or higher. So in those countries, what Basis provides for them for the first time is a stable currency accessible to anyone with an internet connection. So basically in these countries all over the world, places like Argentina, Zimbabwe, Venezuela, it's like a long list of them, they already have a very thriving black market for physical paper dollars. So they're literally taking like $10,000 in their coats across the borders to these countries, just so that they can have a shot at stable value. Like that's really like what they're trying to get. And so what Basis is for the first time is you can have it if you just have an internet connection, right? And so we think that basically by improving the access to stable currency, it's going to essentially provide fill this need for these countries that are already expressing it in other ways that are very obvious, right? And so so that's kind of I think how Basis interacts with like developing kind of country fiat. And I would say for the U.S., I don't think it's really intended at all to overtake the dollar. I would say that it's probably, you could think of it more as like an insurance policy, where basically if the U.S. ends up having rampant inflation or if the dollar dies, like, do you want the Chinese money to be the thing that everyone uses? Like, no. I mean, it would be better if that thing were neutral and independent and decentralized. And so I think for the developed countries of the world, Basis is really just a check against against doing goofy things, which Bitcoin is as well. I mean, all these cryptocurrencies, I think one of the biggest appeals is the kind of insurance policy that they are.
Makes sense. Let's skip down to another question from, let's see here. Here's a good question from Tim Miltz, which is, while it looks like Basis has great planning behind it and has a potential alternative to sovereign-based currencies, do you have any thoughts about practical ways to bring the ease of use that those types of traditional currencies have to consumers and merchants? I like, for example, these new crypto-backed Visa cards. So any thoughts on those lines about how we can actually go to market and get folks to adopt Basis in a practical way?
Yeah, so we think about this problem a lot. And so we think that solving the scalability problem is pretty important to get us all the way there. Additionally, we think that the creation of very easy tools for consumers like apps is another really important thing that we have to build. And so for us, focusing on the existence of a scalable, easy to use consumer platform, we think is kind of the where we want to be. But what's interesting is, in the short run, there are a lot of useful things for stable currencies that do not involve like the most basic consumer. One of the biggest ones being used on exchanges as a store of value to basically speculate on dips. So, if you're on a cryptocurrency exchange and you think the price of Bitcoin is going to go down, you want to sell all your Bitcoin and hold something stable. But a lot of cryptocurrency exchanges don't have dollars there, right? They're crypto only, and so Basis can serve a really big need there. The interesting thing is, there's other things that, sorry, I lost my track, but the high level is that being used on cryptocurrency exchanges is already a pretty useful thing, and then growing that beachhead into a consumer product is kind of, we think, the next path.
That's great. Okay, and so we'll come back to the audience in just a second for some more questions, but I had a couple of other topics I want to talk to you about. So let's talk about some possible scenarios that may be unfortunate and how that might impact Basis. So for example, like let's say the economy doesn't grow. Does that affect Basis? Does that hurt it if there's recession or if there's no growth at all, if there's zero growth in the economy? Does that hurt Basis? And what are your thoughts on all that?
Yeah, it's a great question. So we have a pretty good FAQ question that talks about kind of, what if demand looks like this? What if demand looks like that? Like, can Basis remain stable? We also have a really thorough stability analysis that we're going to publish soon that goes through in a lot of detail, basically literally watching how Basis would have performed through like the Mexican peso crisis and through all kinds of different crises compared to what the existing fiats actually, what happened to them. So what's really interesting about Basis, right, is that again, it's collateralizing on future demand, and the question is like, is future demand going to be enough to pay the risk premium to bondholders that they need in order to keep Basis stable, right? That's really like kind of the question you want to ask. And so the way you analyze that is you look at the growth in demand of other currencies, and cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin as well, and see how the volatility compares to the growth in demand for all of those currencies, right? And that's how we analyze Basis to see how it's going to perform in real world circumstances. And so we're going to make all of our research on that public really soon. But the high level answer to that question is, so first of all, no monetary system is stable under all circumstances. Everything is going to be volatile if you do enough stress on it. That's just how it is. But we think that Basis can actually be better than all the things that exist today, right? And so we think that exciting result, essentially, it's basically the best you can do, and also like a significant improvement over the status quo.
That's great.
And so that's how we think about it.
And what role do traders play in your ecosystem, and how do they? How are they strategic for you in your future going forward?
Yeah, it's a great question. So if you think about Basis, right, the users of Basis are like normal, ordinary people. They want to use it to transact or store value, and they probably don't want to ever think about like participating in the bond auction, for example. It's not something that they want to be saddled with mentally. And so, and actually, it's very similar to dollars today. Like people generally use dollars, but they don't really think about, like they think about buying bonds maybe like when they think about their retirement that one time, and then they never think about it again. It depends on the person. But the bonds are actually, they're bought and traded by liquidity providers and traders who are basically devote their lives to keeping that market efficient. And then because they're keeping that market efficient, the dollar stays stable, right? So that's kind of the synergistic thing between these market makers and traders and the consumers of the dollar. And so it's a very similar ecosystem for Basis. We have people who use Basis, and we have market makers and traders. And so building up that liquidity for the bonds is top priority. And that's actually a big reason why we wanted lots of liquidity providers involved in our recent fundraising round. So we ended up getting DRW, Octagon, and people from Circle. And so, getting them on board and working with them, it's basically the other side of the two-sided market. So,
makes sense.
Yeah.
And what keeps you up at night, Nader? Like, what are the current challenges you and your team are wrestling with, and what's in the foreseeable future in terms of the obstacles you have to overcome in the coming year?
Yeah, it's a great question. I actually sleep like a baby, for better or worse. But the problems, the biggest thing that I think we're thinking about a lot is basically we're working really, really hard to be compliant. So we're a U.S. company, and we're good guys. Like we're not, at the end of the day, we don't want to do things that break the law or undermine the government or anything like that. And so making sure that we engineer our blockchain in a way that's compliant with existing regulations, particularly SEC and CFTC, has been something that we're working really hard on, and I think a lot of our efforts going there. Another thing that's been honestly really fun, but a lot of work, and keeps you up at night, like thinking about the difficulties, is engineering our blockchain on Ethereum, or our contracts on Ethereum. It's a lot of really great problems that we've solved there around doing a bond auction, doing the distribution to shares, and all that kind of, all the mechanics of that. So yeah, I mean, engineering and compliance are pretty much the two big things that we're pounding through right now.
That's great. And is everything that you're developing going to be open source and available for everyone to look at and inspect?
Yeah, definitely. We fully expect all of the code to be, auditable, visible, contributable by everybody. So yeah.
And when you think about, I agree with that decision. I think it's important for the community to really trust this and to believe in it, for it to be open source. But of course, that then leads into the next question, which is, did it ever cross your minds that, could you be giving away the keys to the kingdom here? Could anyone else take these innovations and maybe improve on it or build another system based on it? Did you guys ever worry about that, or was it a non-factor for you guys to do it from open source from the beginning?
Yeah, so we actually haven't gone through how we intend to bootstrap Basis, but that actually plays into the answer to this question. We don't talk about it yet. We're going to publish a bunch of docs on essentially how the system's going to work in the early days. But the high level really is that to bootstrap a system like Basis, we think you need a large pool of capital, just to keep that thing stable in the early days. Like, the way to think about it is the Basis mechanism has strong incentives for speculators and liquidity providers to buy the bonds and keep Basis stable. But the problem is, when it's small, there's not enough volume, there's not enough profit-making opportunity for the speculators and the liquidity providers to be interested. And so to get the system to the point where it's big enough for liquidity providers and speculators to care and keep it stable on its own, we think it's important for any system like Basis to basically have a large pool of liquidity that it uses to essentially act as that speculator early on. And so we think that at a high level, yes, making the code transparent is something that is what do you call it? Like I guess a way for someone to compete with us. But at the same time, we have enough of an economic moat with our brand and with our our ability to keep it stable early on, that we don't think it's a big deal. And honestly, even if it was a big deal, I mean, fuck it. Like, I mean, it has to be transparent and visible to everyone, or else it doesn't really. Why would you use that, right? So I think it's culturally,
it's a very forward-thinking way of being, and it's kind of funny because, like, a lot of the folks who are worried about this, they might not have confidence in their own team and their ability to maintain the technology. But when you have confidence that this is going to require iteration, it's going to require improvement over time. There's going to be minor adjustments as we go on. Someone else who would be the steward of that won't necessarily benefit from all those improvements. There's the brand issue. There's the lack of access to capital, to the traders, to the ecosystem. So it seems like it's a non-factor from my perspective as well. That's great.
Yeah.
So we asked the audience a couple polls before we started here. Let's see what the audience said. So, and we can ask some more polls too, Nader. So cool. The first question is, have you heard of stablecoins before Hack Summit? And actually, about a third of our audience has heard of them. So we've got
very educated.
We've got an educated audience. But then what's nice here is that we've educated 2/3 of the audience on a new topic that they hadn't heard of before, which is pretty cool. So we're exposing this concept to a new group of people. And then, have you heard of Basis before? We have about 17% of the audience who had heard of it.
Awesome.
And then about 83%, it's new information for them.
Yep.
So,
that's cool.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Let's see. Let's jump back to the audience and answer a few other questions here.
Sure.
2 more minutes. Let's see here. So the first question from John is, would you consider most or all cryptocurrencies to be fiat currency? And would Basis have the same consideration?
Well, I mean, I think it depends how you define fiat. To me, fiat means it's kind of run by a government. So I would consider most cryptocurrencies that are sufficiently decentralized to not be fiat currencies. Similarly, I think when Basis is decentralized and independent and all that, I don't think I would really call it a fiat currency. Yeah.
So there's a couple of questions here that we've kind of already answered in other forms. I'm going to skip those. Here's an interesting question from Alexander, which is, he basically says the possibility of a price change is why why people are attracted to cryptocurrency in the first place. As a speculator or as an investor, not having this, what will attract users, basically, is what his question is.
Yeah, it's an excellent question. And so really, the way to think about Basis is as a totally different product than existing cryptocurrencies. Existing cryptocurrencies, they're kind of like gold. They're a speculative asset. Basis is really kind of like a dollar. And for that reason, they have totally different use cases. Bitcoin is kind of a gold-like, speculative asset that you might use as a store of value. Basis, you use it to actually do transactions, right? To do loans, salaries, but moreover, just basic transactions, any kind of two-party transaction where people need to agree on a value and transfer it. We think you're going to want to use Basis mainly because if you use anything else that exists, most of these things are really volatile and change all the time. So you really have to take your mind and kind of open it up to all the other uses of money other than just holding it as a speculative asset, and you immediately start seeing all these things that you're like, oh wow, we really need a stable currency for this. Another great example, we have distributed apps that are emailing us every week. Saying, oh my God, I need this thing. A great example is Augur. So a lot of people probably haven't heard of Augur, but it's like a prediction market on the blockchain. You can bet on is President Trump going to get elected and stuff like that. And what's tricky there is if the token that you're denominating the bet in is volatile, and if there's a month until the bet actually comes through, then you're betting more on the price of the token than you are on the actual underlying bet. And so we see tons of use cases for Basis that are similar to this, where it's just a normal cryptocurrency just isn't going to work. And so, it's a totally different product. It's really for these kind of things where you need stability.
That's great. Thank you, Nader. We'll skip down to a question from Emmanuel here, which is more of an educational question. What are some good resources for learning more about monetary systems? And I assume this is being asked because you've kind of sparked his imagination here today. This is probably a new topic for a lot of folks in the audience. So how can they learn more about this topic that you're so passionate about? So, we try hard to kind of cover a lot of background in our white paper on our website, basis.io. But beyond that, I think there are a lot of really great monetary history books. I think one of them is called Golden Fetters. That's pretty interesting. Another one is A Monetary History of the United States by Milton Friedman. If you read that book, you've got a lot of the background there. I think there are a few other influential books that you can Google and read. But I think if you start there, that's pretty powerful stuff. So that's great. Thank you, Nader. So then Scott Rudiger asked this question as a follow-up to his previous question, which is, once you eventually move Basis no longer being pegged to a dollar, but being pegged to a basket of goods approach, he assumes that the currency will then be available globally. In that case, who or what will the price of the basket of goods be recorded? Meaning there's different geographical areas, each have vastly different prices, and they each have different inflationary or deflationary periods. How does the algorithm take this all into account?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's first important to understand the point of having Basis or any currency be worth a basket of goods is you can do financial contracts in that currency that are actually meaningful to you. So, for example, if you have a loan or a salary and it's denominated in milk and bread that you need to buy, right? That's more useful than something that's going to fluctuate in those terms, right? You actually need to buy those things, so you'd rather all of your contracts be denominated in those things. So that's kind of the motivation behind using a basket of goods as a reference for a currency, right? So then the question is kind of okay, well, which basket do you use, right? Do you use a global basket or a local basket? And so Basis can transition in two different ways, actually. The first way is that it can be a global basket, weighted by the amount of Basis in each country, and you compute it like that. That's one way to do it. But another way to do it is to actually, we haven't written this in our white paper, but this is actually coming out in our next white paper, is you can take the Basis currency and split it into different currencies that are local, but still function in the same algorithmic way, but they're getting different different prices for each Basis currency and issuing different bonds for each of those. So it's kind of like a different, almost like taking the giant unified basis and splitting it. And so those are kind of the two ways to do it. Either basically making a more robust and aligned version of the individual fiats, or just creating one global unified currency, which has its own merits.
Well, that's very interesting. And so if you split it up like that into small mini basis currencies, could each of those theoretically have their own brand as well and be tied to a local ecosystem?
Yeah, they absolutely could. The way we think about this is if, let's say that basis takes over in Mexico and Africa, or Latin America and Africa, just as an example, right? And let's suppose that we deem those two economies to be just like so totally independent of each other. Then what happens is the protocol can essentially, I wouldn't call it a fork, but it's kind of like a fork. And so the protocol can fork and say, okay, cool, like the Latin American tokens are going to be, you basically take that basis and you convert it into Latin American basis and African basis. And so you can just convert those, and then each of those have their own currency, but leveraging that same stability mechanism layer in the top. And so that's kind of one thing you can do if you end up with a lot of different independent economies using the stable currency.
Great, thanks. We have another question which got a lot of votes from Lewis, which is, do you think that basis could solve the volatility of currencies of countries who start developing their own official cryptocurrencies, which are distributed and tied to an official fiat currency? So I guess what he's trying to say here is, can we solve these currency fluctuation problems that happen in these local economies? And then maybe I'll add to that, which is, how do we actually get that implemented on the ground, and how do we convince the government to embrace that? Yeah,
all really, really great questions. And so, with regard to the local fiat, you have to understand. The big question you have to ask is, like, what are the incentives of the issuing body to keep it stable, right? In basis, the mechanism is fairly straightforward. It's basically it's basically a feedback controller with governance from the share tokens, who are fully aligned and incentivized to keep the system in growing and in good shape. And so it's this like something that we think is actually more aligned than anything that's really existed in past. But at a high level, you have to ask, like, what's the government doing, and like, what's its motivation, right? In a lot of these developing countries, the motivations tend to be short-sighted or selfish, in the sense that someone wants to like print money for the government and then spend that money on corruption or something like that. So to the extent countries exhibit malfeasance like that, basis can actually offer something a lot more reliable than anything that they have access to. But again, if a country is very happy with its fiat, is doing a good job managing that fiat, there's basis. If they want to be able to transact with other people, that could be one reason. But like, it's not like our agenda to come in and mess up that country. Like, if that is working, that is good. Like, it's not necessarily something care about. The problem is that a lot of countries don't have a reliable and aligned way to keep their currency stable. And so for those countries, basis comes in as a 10x improvement over the status quo. So
that's very inspiring. And so I'll ask another question on behalf of the audience here, which is that a lot of the theory from basis comes from kind of the field of quantitative finance, quant programming, and I know your team has a lot of experience in that area. That is probably a new subject for a lot of our audience members. A lot of our audience members may be cloud developers, blockchain developers, mobile developers that are just getting into this field and learning about it now. So maybe you could help them understand, like, what is a quant programmer, what is the quant finance field, and how can what is it like to be in that field, and what would be a career like that look like? Just that our audience understands that.
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't have a crazy amount of experience in the quant finance field, but at a high level, it really can run the gamut. What I was doing at D.E. Shaw was equities algorithmic trading, and what that consisted of was basically running regressions on like 20-minute returns to figure out, can we predict returns better in this way or that way. And just really trying to predict, like, where is the price going to go 20 minutes from now, and then trading on that forecast. And so I think in general, when people think of quant finance, they think of that shorter term, using kind of regressions and machine learning to predict the price and trading on it. And so I think that that's definitely a big part of quant finance. With Basis, what's interesting is there's much more of a macro focus in the sense that we're not thinking about 20-minute fluctuations as much as we're thinking about 20-year fluctuations. So it's a little different in that sense. The way that I would say that it's similar is that we're really using, and I think this will be really evident in our stability analysis when we release it, among our other kind of research materials that I think will be exciting. But we're just using math and some pretty low-level programming to try and create the most robust monetary system that's existed, and gain confidence that it is actually robust. And so I would say, to the extent that we are using math and quantitative tools to get there, that's really the big similarity.
Great.
So,
we got one last question here from Mies L. Pace, which is, how does Basis deal with the differential between functions of currency and reflections of currency in stores of value, such as lesser liquid assets, such as stocks, bonds, and real estate and property? Is there a method that allows Basis to mediate between those two states of money?
Very good question. I'm not sure. I'm not sure if this is an answer, but I mean, again, I think the way that you use Basis is essentially as buffer capital, right? Like, you need to buy this amount of, bread or milk or maybe bonds or stocks, and so normal people use it as a backstop in case something bad happens, and then they still have this amount of money that they can use to sustain themselves. Similarly, investors, we think will use Basis, to wait out volatility. So they'll come out of stocks, or they'll come out of cryptocurrency like Bitcoin, and they'll wait in Basis, and then when they're ready, they go back into whatever volatile asset they want to go into. And so in that sense, I think Basis is kind of like this. It's almost like this glue, or this kind of like economic-wide buffer that you can come into when you think things are a little too hot in the real speculative world. And so that's kind of how I think it interplays with things. Yeah.
That's great. Thanks, Nader. And so, so last question here from Nellie in our audience. She says, awesome. She's super inspired by what you said. Where can we buy some Basis? So I guess maybe a question is, what is your timetable for rollout roughly look like at this point?
Yeah, so we're actually gonna have some big announcements soon. We haven't officially announced our timeline, but you're gonna be able to buy and use Basis by the end of the year. So that's in the next few months.
That's great. And is there anything actionable that the engineers in the audience can do to get involved in some way going forward?
Definitely. Until we release our code, we're actually centralized. We're operating out of Hoboken, New Jersey, so 10 minutes from Manhattan by the PATH train. And so if you want to, contribute, you can go to our website, read our materials, also apply. We're hiring right now, and in the future, once our code and stuff is public, you can participate in that community as well. Otherwise, you can subscribe, whether you're interested in collaborating or not. You can subscribe on our website, basis.io, for updates. And so,
Great. Well, thank you, Nader. Any parting words to the audience before we go?
Let's do it, guys. I mean,
I'm excited. I can't wait to see you roll this out. So thanks so much for being with us here, Nader. We learned a lot. Nader Al-Naji here, from the CEO of Basis. Really appreciate your time here. We'll be back in just a few minutes here with Oasis Labs, who's going to give us an incredible educational talk on a new scalable blockchain. So thanks so much again, Nader. And we appreciate your time today. We know how busy you are. So thanks again.
Yep. We'll see you later.